John Miller never thought an HOA dispute could feel like a battlefield until the day a simple notice shattered his peaceful life. The sun had just dipped behind the rolling hills surrounding his ranch when the mail carrier handed him a thick, official-looking envelope. It was heavy, crisp, and sealed with an unfamiliar emblem. John's fingers tightened around the edges as he tore it open. Inside was a demand from the board of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association: immediate removal of all fencing encroaching on HOA common land. The letter was cold, legalistic, and backed by threats of fines and legal action. But what caught John's eye wasn't the words themselves. It was the tone. It carried an unmistakable edge of menace, as if this was just the beginning. John glanced toward the boundary where his weathered wooden fence stretched out like a silent sentinel across the property line. That fence had been standing for generations, a relic left by his great-grandfather, a pioneer who had first settled the land. The fence wasn't just wood and nails. It was a symbol of heritage, of family pride. But the HOA didn't see that. To them, it was a line that must be erased. As dusk fell, John's mind raced. The neighborhood had always been tight-knit, but lately, the HOA had grown aggressive, more interested in control than community. He'd heard whispers about how some board members were pushing for new developments, eyeing the open land near his ranch like vultures circling prey. Just as John was about to shrug it off, his phone buzzed with a message. The words were chilling: remove the fence or face consequences. This is your final warning. The message had no sender ID. John's heart pounded. Was this a prank or something more sinister? Later that night, as shadows stretched long across his property, John stepped outside to inspect the fence by moonlight. The cool breeze whispered through the tall grass, and the ranch was eerily silent. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught his eye near the tree line. He froze. Out of the darkness, two figures darted between the trees, carrying something that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. Before John could react, they disappeared into the night, leaving behind an unsettling silence and a faint scent of smoke. The next morning, John woke to a strange feeling. His instinct screamed that something was wrong. Walking toward the fence, he noticed scorch marks etched into the wood, fresh, deliberate, and unmistakably made by fire. His ranch was under threat. Word spread quickly. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting that afternoon. Fingers pointed, accusations flew, and a whispered campaign began to paint John as the problem, the troublemaker refusing to comply with community rules. But John knew better. The tension in Willow Creek was rising, like a slow-burning fuse waiting to explode. Neighbors who once greeted him with smiles now avoided his gaze. Mail stopped coming. Phone calls went unanswered. Even his closest friends seemed wary, caught in the web of the HOA's growing influence. Still, John refused to back down. He had learned something long ago. Power isn't always visible, and beneath the surface of every conflict lies a deeper current, one that could change everything. That night, as he sat on the porch with a weathered map spread before him, John traced his finger along lines marked decades ago, land grants dating back to his ancestors, grants that stretched far beyond Willow Creek, across counties and state lines. No one in the HOA knew about this. No one understood that John wasn't just a rancher fighting a petty dispute. He was a keeper of a legacy, one that gave him control over land that could topple the HOA's ambitions and rewrite the rules of ownership entirely. But first, he had to survive the firestorm closing in on his home. And the silent war was just beginning. The crackle of fire shattered the stillness of the night, ripping through the silence like a scream. John Miller jolted awake, his heart pounding as the acrid smell of smoke invaded his lungs. Flames licked hungrily at the edge of his property, swallowing the dry grass and edging dangerously close to the barn. He raced outside, the cool night air stinging his face, his boots pounding the dirt as he fought the urge to panic. The fire was spreading fast, fueled by a dry wind that whispered secrets of destruction. The glow illuminated shadowy figures moving just beyond the blaze, silhouettes disappearing into the darkness. John's mind raced. This wasn't an accident. His ranch, his family's legacy, was under siege. Neighbors stood behind their windows, but no one dared come out. The HOA's words from weeks ago echoed in John's mind. The veiled threats, the harsh letters, the chilling message demanding the fence's removal. This fire wasn't just a blaze, it was a message. By dawn, much of the ranch was charred and smoking, the barn reduced to a skeletal frame. John stood among the ashes, numb. The fire department ruled it accidental, citing a possible electrical fault, but John knew better. The fencing had remained untouched, but now the ruins lay bare, proof of a brutal warning. Days later, at the HOA's monthly meeting, the board wasted no time. They publicly blamed John for reckless negligence, painting him as a dangerous element within the community. The atmosphere was thick with hostility, neighbors whispering behind his back, eyes filled with suspicion. But John was gathering his own evidence, piecing together fragments others overlooked. The night of the fire, security cameras on his property had mysteriously gone dark. The hard drives were missing, wiped clean. Nearby witnesses reported seeing a black SUV speeding away moments before the fire erupted. Footprints near the burned fence showed signs of careful erasure. Someone had tried to cover their tracks. Yet the HOA dismissed these clues, burying their heads in official statements and denials. John realized this was no simple property dispute. It was a calculated attack designed to break him. Haunted by the destruction, John withdrew into his study, poring over dusty legal documents, maps, and ancestral deeds. Among them was a faded, yellowed parchment, a land grant signed decades ago by a governor, transferring vast acreage to John's family. This was no ordinary property. It was a hidden treasure of legal power. Suddenly, the stakes were clear. The HOA didn't just want the fence removed. They wanted control over land John's family had owned long before the neighborhood existed. Determined, John contacted an old friend, Sarah Ramirez, a sharp-witted attorney specializing in land law. Their conversations crackled with urgency. "This isn't just about Willow Creek," Sarah warned. "You hold sway over thousands of acres through these grants. If you use them wisely, you could flip the entire power structure." But John hesitated. Fighting the HOA meant facing not only local hostility, but powerful developers lurking behind the scenes, pulling strings in shadows. If they were willing to burn down his ranch, what lengths would they go to next? That night, as John sat alone in the darkness, his phone buzzed again. A cryptic message appeared: "Step back or lose everything." No signature. The silence that followed was deafening. John clenched his fists. They thought the fire would scare him off. Instead, it lit a fire within him, a burning determination to fight back, to protect not just his home, but the legacy beneath the scorched earth. The battle lines were drawn, and the war had only just begun. The morning sun cast a pale glow over the blackened remains of John Miller's ranch, but the light did little to warm his spirits. As he walked the perimeter, stepping cautiously around the charred debris, a deep unease settled in his chest. This wasn't just about lost fences or burnt barns anymore. It was about something far bigger, something buried beneath the ashes. John's fingers brushed over a half-burned scrap of paper caught in the twisted wreckage. He bent down, heart pounding, and carefully unfolded it. It was a letter, aged and fragile, yet unmistakably authentic. The handwriting was familiar, his great-grandfather's. The letter hinted at a hidden truth, a secret deed buried deep within the family's archives, a land grant that stretched beyond the ranch's visible borders across the state. A grant that, if activated, could change everything. That afternoon, John descended into the musty basement of his family home, a room filled with decades of forgotten memories. Among dusty crates and weathered trunks, he found the old wooden chest his grandfather had once locked tight. Inside were stacks of faded documents, maps, and ledgers, forgotten remnants of a past life. His fingers trembled as he found it. A thick folder stamped with the seal of the State Land Commission, the original land grant, dated over 100 years ago, detailing rights to vast swaths of land, including the very property the HOA now claimed to govern. John's breath caught. No wonder the HOA had been so aggressive. Their grasp on the land was tenuous at best. His ancestors had rights that dwarfed the HOA's authority, rights that could topple their entire power structure. But with great power came great risk. John knew the HOA wasn't just a local nuisance. They were a front for a shadowy group of developers hungry to seize control of the land for lucrative projects. The fire, the threats, the intimidation, all part of a carefully orchestrated campaign to crush him. He couldn't fight this alone. That evening, John called Sarah Ramirez again. "I found the grant," he said, voice low but resolute. "It changes everything." Sarah's reply was quick and sharp. "This is your ace, John. But you need to act fast. If the HOA finds out you're digging into this, they'll come after you harder. You have to be smart, quiet, but deadly." Meanwhile, whispers began to spread through the town. Neighbors who once turned their backs started to look at John differently, curious, cautious. Rumors circulated of his family's old legacy, the mysterious land rights that no one had dared to mention. But trust was fragile. John felt eyes watching him wherever he went, some friendly, others filled with suspicion. A knock at his door late one night revealed a stranger with a cryptic message. "The past holds the key, but the future holds the trap." John's pulse quickened. Who was this messenger? Friend or foe? He knew one thing for certain. His family's history was not just a relic, it was a weapon, and it was time to wield it. As days passed, John began quietly rallying support, reaching out to allies he could trust. The local historian who understood the land grants, a retired surveyor with decades of knowledge, and a few brave neighbors disillusioned by the HOA's tyranny. Together, they mapped out a plan, one that would reveal the truth to the community, expose the corruption, and reclaim the land that was rightfully his family's. But the closer John came to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. One evening, a chilling discovery shook him to the core, a threatening note pinned to his door with a rusty nail. The words were scrawled in anger, "Stop digging or burn with the rest." The message was clear. Someone was watching. Someone willing to kill to keep the secret buried. John clenched his jaw, staring at the note long into the night. The fire that destroyed his ranch had only been the opening salvo. Now, the battle was personal. The secrets beneath the ashes were alive, and they demanded justice. John Miller's world was unraveling faster than he could keep pace. The threatening note on his door was a stark reminder. This wasn't just a dispute with an HOA. It was a deadly game controlled by powerful puppeteers pulling strings from the shadows. The question gnawed at him. Who were they? Determined to uncover the truth, John began piecing together fragments of conversations, whispered rumors, and subtle hints dropped by wary neighbors. One name kept surfacing in hushed tones: Landon Pierce, a wealthy developer with a reputation for ruthless acquisitions and shadowy tactics. Pierce wasn't just interested in building homes or shopping centers. His empire spanned industries and politics, and his influence seeped into every corner of the county. The Willow Creek HOA was merely a tool, a blunt instrument wielded to clear obstacles in his path. John's gut told him Pierce was behind the fire, the threats, and the intimidation that had turned his peaceful life into a nightmare. But how deep did the corruption run? Late one night, John found himself parked across the street from the Willow Creek HOA's headquarters. The building was dark, except for a single flickering light in the boardroom. Shadows danced behind the curtains, and muffled voices drifted through the air. John pressed closer, straining to catch snippets of the conversation. "We need to shut Miller down before he discovers more," a cold, commanding voice said. "If he keeps digging into those land grants, it could ruin everything." Another voice, softer but equally menacing, responded, "We'll have the county revoke his permits. The fire was just a warning. Next time, it will be worse." John's blood ran cold. The fire hadn't been an accident. It was a message from Pierce's operatives. Blatant intimidation, meant to force him off his land. But John wasn't so easily cowed. Armed with this knowledge, he contacted Sarah Ramirez, urgency thick in his voice. "They're coordinating the attacks, Sarah. It's bigger than I thought. Pierce is orchestrating this." Sarah's response was grim. "This is a war, John, and you just stepped onto the battlefield." Over the next days, John intensified his investigation. He traced financial ties linking several HOA board members to Pierce's companies, contracts for construction, landscaping, and security that funneled money back to the developers' pockets. Friends who had once been loyal to the HOA began distancing themselves, sensing the rot beneath the surface. One evening, John met with Michael Jennings, a former HOA member who had resigned in protest. Jennings was cagey, but willing to talk. They never cared about the community, Jennings whispered, glancing over his shoulder. Pierce promised them money, power, and protection. They were happy to be his puppets, until you came along. John's anger simmered, but he kept his focus sharp. He couldn't afford to make mistakes, not with lives and legacies on the line. Meanwhile, strange things began happening around his property. Late-night trespasses, vandalism, and once again, security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned. John realized Pierce's reach extended beyond politics and money. He had people watching, listening, ready to strike at the slightest threat. Yet John found unexpected strength in his allies. Sarah's legal expertise uncovered loopholes in Pierce's plans, and the retired surveyor validated John's claims to the land grants, providing critical documentation to back his case. With the community growing wary of the HOA's corruption, whispers of revolt stirred. The very people who once feared John started to see him as their champion, an underdog standing against a corporate giant. But Pierce wouldn't surrender without a fight. John received another chilling message, this time slipped under his door with a black card, "Give up or lose everything. This is your final warning." John stared at the card long into the night, fury and determination burning in his eyes. The puppet masters had been revealed. Now, it was time to cut the strings. John Miller sat in his cramped home office, papers spread out across the desk like a battlefield map. Every document was a weapon: deeds, maps, court filings, letters from the HOA, and pieces of the land grant that held his family's claim to the sprawling acreage. This was no longer a simple property dispute. It was a war fought with signatures, lawsuits, and loopholes. Sarah Ramirez, his trusted attorney, paced the room, eyes sharp beneath the harsh glow of the desk lamp. "We've got a fighting chance," she said, voice steady but tense. "The land grants are solid. The problem is the HOA and Pierce's influence. They've stacked the deck with friendly judges and bureaucrats." John's jaw clenched. The system was rigged against him, but the fire that had nearly destroyed his ranch had ignited something fiercer, a refusal to be crushed by corruption. Their first move was a formal injunction against the HOA's demolition orders and fines. Sarah filed the paperwork late into the night, aware that every second counted. If the court granted it, John could stop the HOA from tearing down what remained of his property. But if they lost, the next attack would be irreversible. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and John knew the courtroom would be a battleground of shadows. Pierce had deep pockets, and his legal team was as ruthless as his business tactics. In the days leading up to the hearing, John noticed strange cars parked near his home, unfamiliar faces watching his every move. Threatening calls came again, this time with recorded silence on the other end, a sinister reminder that his enemies were always listening. But John also found unexpected allies. Neighbors who had once whispered against him now stepped forward with testimony. They spoke of suspicious meetings between HOA board members and developers, of bribes and threats, of the fire that destroyed John's barn. Their courage bolstered his resolve. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Pierce's lawyers arrived in expensive suits, their confidence bordering on arrogance. John felt the weight of the room, the judge's indifferent gaze, the skeptical jurors, the flashing cameras. Sarah was calm though. She laid out the facts methodically. The validity of the land grants, the HOA's overreach, and the developer's shadowy influence. The testimony of witnesses painted a picture of a corrupt HOA, manipulated by corporate greed. Pierce's legal team countered fiercely, attacking the documents, questioning witnesses' credibility, and painting John as a troublemaker resisting community progress. The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. The tension was electric. After hours of arguments and evidence, the judge called for a recess. John sat in the hallway, heart pounding. Outside, protesters holding signs supporting John and condemning the HOA gathered, their voices a mixture of hope and anger. When the judge returned, silence fell. The court finds merit in the plaintiff's claims, the judge announced. An injunction is granted to halt any demolition or enforcement actions by the HOA against Mr. Miller's property until further review. A surge of relief flooded John's body, but Sarah's eyes warned caution. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. "Pierce won't back down. He'll escalate. We need to prepare for the next fight." And she was right. That night, as John returned home, a new message awaited him on his doorstep. This time, a charred photo of his burned barn and a single word scrawled beneath, "Endgame." John stared at the photo, a cold fire igniting in his chest. The legal battlefield had been won, but the war was far from over. The final moves were being made, and John Miller was ready to face whatever came next. The air hung thick with tension as John Miller stood at the edge of what remained of his ranch, the charred skeleton of the barn looming behind him like a grim reminder of all he'd lost. The court victory felt like a small beacon in a vast storm. Yet, with every step forward, the shadows around him grew darker, closer. Pierce's threat, the word endgame, echoed in John's mind. It was no idle warning. It was a promise that Pierce would not stop until he had crushed John completely. Days passed in a blur of meetings, calls, and planning sessions with Sarah and their growing circle of allies. But beneath the surface, John felt the walls closing in. One night, as he sat reviewing documents, the power suddenly cut out. The house was swallowed by darkness. Then, a faint tapping came from the back window. John froze, heart pounding. A shadow slipped away into the night. His security system, which had just been repaired, was now offline. Someone was inside his property, watching, waiting. The next morning brought more disturbing signs. Tire tracks scorched into the mud, a shattered mailbox, and a package left on his doorstep. Inside, a single bullet and a note, "Last chance." John's family urged him to leave, but he refused. This was no longer just about property. It was about legacy, justice, survival. With renewed determination, John dug deeper into Pierce's operations. He discovered that Pierce had begun filing paperwork to annex the surrounding lands, using forged documents and bribed officials. If Pierce succeeded, John would be surrounded, isolated, his land cut off, his rights nullified. John's allies rallied to expose the forgery. They reached out to investigative journalists, local politicians, and community leaders. The story began to spread, a corrupt developer using fire, intimidation, and fraud to seize control. But Pierce was not idle. His operatives infiltrated town hall meetings, spreading misinformation and discrediting John as a dangerous troublemaker and land speculator. The tension in the town reached a breaking point. One evening, John received an unexpected visitor, Detective Elena Vasquez, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for uncovering corruption. "I've been following your case," she said quietly. "Pierce's reach is wider than you think. There's more going on beneath the surface, involving officials at the highest levels." John realized then that this fight wasn't just about land or money. It was a battle against a network of power designed to silence anyone who dared resist. With Detective Vasquez's help, John coordinated a covert operation to gather concrete evidence, recordings, documents, witness testimonies that could bring Pierce and his allies down. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. Late one night, John's phone buzzed with a new message, a video showing a drone flying over his property, capturing every move he made, every conversation he had. "You're being watched," the message said. John looked out his window into the black night, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. Yet, despite the fear, he refused to back down. The stakes had never been higher. Pierce's empire was closing in, but John's resolve was a flame that could not be extinguished. The final confrontation was drawing near. John Miller sat in the dim glow of his living room, the drone footage looping silently on his laptop. Every flicker of the tiny machine's camera revealed how deeply Pierce's forces had infiltrated his life. Every step, every word was now public, or at least in the hands of his enemies. But John was no longer just reacting. He was preparing to strike. Detective Elena Vasquez sat beside him, her eyes sharp and focused. "We've got enough to bring Pierce down legally, but the challenge is getting the evidence out before he covers his tracks." John nodded. He knew time was running out. Pierce's empire was vast, and the longer this dragged on, the more he could manipulate officials and destroy proof. That night, John made a decision. It was time to use the very land grants that had sparked this battle as leverage, but in a way no one had anticipated. The next morning, John convened a meeting at the local community center with his allies, neighbors, the retired surveyor, Sarah, Detective Vasquez, and a group of investigative journalists he had contacted. The room buzzed with quiet tension. John laid out his plan, a public filing of his family's historic land grants, backed by the latest forensic evidence of fraud and corruption. The grants, once obscure legal documents, would become a powerful tool to reclaim control of the land, not just his ranch, but all the contested properties under the HOA's jurisdiction. But there was a catch. To activate the grants, John had to submit them to the state's Land Rights Committee in person, a high-profile move that would invite a direct confrontation with Pierce's forces. It was a gamble, a public declaration of war. Sarah cautioned, "If Pierce knows you're going to do this, he'll try to stop you, legally or otherwise." John met her gaze with unwavering resolve. "Then I'll be ready." The weeks leading up to the filing were a whirlwind of preparation. Security tightened around John's property. Elena worked with state officials to ensure the hearing was monitored and transparent. Journalists prepared their reports, ready to expose the corruption. The day of the hearing arrived. John stepped into the packed courtroom, flanked by allies and camera crews. Across the room, Pierce sat with a smug smile, flanked by his legal team. The atmosphere was electric, the tension palpable. John presented the land grants, the forensic analysis of the documents, and the testimonies exposing the HOA's and Pierce's corrupt practices. The courtroom listened as Sarah dismantled Pierce's defense with surgical precision. Then the climax. The hearing room erupted as new evidence was introduced. Recordings from a whistleblower within Pierce's company, detailing orders to burn John's property and bribe officials. Pierce's smug confidence vanished. His lawyers scrambled to suppress the evidence, but it was too late. The judge, visibly shaken, called for a recess. Outside the courtroom, protesters gathered, chanting John's name and demanding justice. After a tense hour, the judge returned with a ruling that stunned the room. The court hereby nullifies all actions taken by the Willow Creek HOA against Mr. Miller and revokes the HOA's jurisdiction over the disputed lands. Furthermore, the state will conduct a full investigation into the fraudulent activities exposed today. Pierce's empire began to crumble in that instant. But the story wasn't over. As the courtroom emptied, John felt a tap on his shoulder. Detective Vasquez whispered urgently, "Pierce isn't finished. He'll try one last move. You need to be ready." John nodded, heart steady despite the storm. He had won the battle, but the war's final move was still ahead. The courtroom emptied, but John Miller's mind raced. The judge's ruling was a landmark victory, one that would reshape the fate of his land and the community. Yet Detective Vasquez's warning echoed in his ears like a storm warning. Pierce wasn't done. The game wasn't over. John returned to his ranch that evening under a fading sun, the smell of scorched earth still heavy in the air. Neighbors gathered near the remnants of his barn, faces filled with cautious hope. For the first time in months, they spoke openly about justice, about reclaiming their community. But John couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger. That night, his phone buzzed with an anonymous tip. Pierce was planning to use his remaining influence to sabotage the upcoming state investigation. The message included details of a meeting between Pierce and several high-ranking officials, a last desperate attempt to bury the truth. With Elena's help, John and Sarah hatched a plan. They needed to catch Pierce red-handed, with irrefutable proof that would shatter any attempts at cover-up. Using a network of trusted allies, they arranged to bug the meeting room at the exclusive country club where Pierce and his cronies planned to gather. It was risky, but necessary. Days later, John sat in a secure location, the device hidden in his pocket. As the live feed crackled through the speakers, the voices of Pierce and the officials spilled into the room. "We crush Miller's case before it reaches the public," Pierce sneered. "We have the power to control the investigation, make it disappear." The officials agreed, laughing coldly at the thought of burying the truth. John's heart pounded. This was it, the smoking gun. Immediately, Sarah transmitted the recording to multiple media outlets and the state's attorney general. The story exploded, igniting outrage across the region. Pierce's allies began to unravel. Within days, indictments were filed. The corrupt officials were suspended, and Pierce was arrested on multiple charges: arson, fraud, bribery, and intimidation. The town felt the tremors of change. The HOA was dissolved, replaced by a community council dedicated to transparency and fairness. Neighbors came together to rebuild what had been lost, starting with John's ranch. John stood before a crowd at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the rebuilt barn, a symbol not just of his family's legacy, but of resilience and justice. Sarah approached him, smiling. "You did it, John. You took back control." John nodded, eyes scanning the faces of his community. "We did it, together." As the sun set over the rolling hills, a new chapter began, one where power no longer silenced the people but served them. Yet, as John looked out across the land he had fought so hard to protect, he knew one thing for certain: vigilance would always be necessary. But for now, justice had prevailed, and the shadows that once threatened to consume his life had been driven away by the light of truth.